Fourthly, I think it's very, very important, as I've said in response to the very penetrating remark by the Justice at the beginning, you cannot take the continuance of democracy for granted. It requires constant vigilance. Fifthly, I think we need to think about the important role of political parties. I look at the United States. I've served, as has been said in the introduction, I served for 5 years in the United States. And the United States is a country that's verging on the border of becoming ungovernable without an extreme crisis impelling it into action. You had a situation where the Congress of the United States couldn't agree on actions to deal with the collapse in the banking system. It went off over the weekend, not having passed the legislation. There was an immediate, dramatic fall in the markets, and they came back on Monday and passed the legislation that they refused to pass the previous Friday. That showed that even though those people knew that such legislation had to be passed, they weren't prepared to face up to their responsibilities. There was a lack of discipline in the system. They are not prepared, for example, in the United States, to confer on their president the capacity to negotiate trade agreements on behalf of the United States on which there will be a yes or no vote on the basis of whatever the president has negotiated. They insist on the ability to unpick every agreement that is made on their behalf by the President of the United States. You wouldn't have any trade agreements anywhere in the world if that was the basis upon which other governments had to negotiate. And why does that apply only in the United States? Because they don't have a proper sense of party discipline. The President of the United States is a Democrat, the leader of the Senate is a Democrat, but they completely disagree on this issue of trade promotion authority. And that's an example of a system where you are not able to do what's best for your people because you don't have a party system that operates in a disciplined fashion. And I think it is very important to recognize the importance of parties as a means also of disciplining their own members if their own members behave in a corrupt fashion. Because the first line of defense very often against corrupt behavior is the colleagues of the person who is engaging in corrupt behavior. So a strong party system is important. That, of course, sometimes requires that if people fail to vote with the party, that they suffer consequences. But I think it would be impossible to conceive of democracy working in an effective way and making decisions in a consequential and sequential way if you didn't have party discipline. And the idea that there's some ideal of democracy where everybody as a member of parliament votes whatever way they think on any issue on any day of the week, that just doesn't work. You need disciplined parties to make that work. And of course sometimes that means that parties will reward their own supporters. And that's one of the things that can go wrong in a political system, where you have too much patronage. You have too much activity by legislators looking after their own home district and ignoring the needs of the rest of the country. Again, if you don't have party discipline, that will get out of hand. So you need to have a relevantly strong degree of discipline. Another area where I think, and I'd reflect here on the experience of my own country in this matter, having politicians close to their constituents. A lot of people will be aware that between 2008 and 2011, there was a major economic collapse in Ireland. Dramatic falls in people's living standards. People moved from a situation where they had substantial wealth and saw that wealth wiped out. People who owned shares in banks saw their entire savings wiped out. People saw the value of the home that they had saved over years to buy fall in value to a quarter of what it had previously been worth. Public servants saw their incomes cut by the government by 15%. Health services, educational services were cut back in ways that many found very hard to take. And yet, unlike Greece, unlike Italy, unlike Spain, there were no riots in Ireland. There were no major street demonstrations. There were obviously bitter complaints, and there was an election subsequently in which the party in office was dramatically defeated on a scale that had never happened before in Irish electoral history. But there were no violent outbreaks of the kind that I mentioned in the other countries. Why was that? I attribute that to the particular electoral system that we have in Ireland. We have a system of proportional representation in multi-seat constituencies, where in a 4-seat or a 5-seat constituency, you will have one member of Parliament from the opposition and maybe 2 or 3 from the government party at any given time. So that everybody is represented and everybody feels they have someone, maybe not as many people as they would like, but some people in Parliament in their constituency representing their point of view. And the competition for being elected in that system, where people can get transfers of second and third preferences from opposite parties in order to be elected, means that the politician has to know as near as possible all his or her electors, regardless of who they would normally vote for, and they have an incentive to get to know him. And that closeness between politician and public, I think, is one of the reasons why people were prepared to accept things in Ireland that they were not prepared to accept in other countries, where they have these national list systems, where the people who go into Parliament are the people that are selected by the leader of the party, not by the voters. People are put on a list and you either vote for the party and you get all the people that they have nominated becoming your members of Parliament, regardless of whether you like them or not. That's the system in Germany, it's the system in Spain as well. I think that system is much more likely to engender the sort of protest that those countries experienced than the Irish system, which is more proportional. So obviously, looking at your electoral system to ensure that politicians stay in reasonably close contact with their electors and with all of their electors is one of the things that you can do to make your democracy stronger and more durable. Obviously, another very important thing is economic conditions. Are the economic conditions such that you have people with an adequate amount of income, that they feel a stake in the country and therefore a stake in the democracy of the country? And that's one of the reasons why people explained in the past that certain African countries were not democratic, because basically the countries weren't well enough off to afford to be democratic. I don't buy that. I think any country can be democratic, no matter how poor or how rich it is, if the resources in that country are reasonably fairly distributed. And Jack Straw made a very apt point, I believe, about the width of the gap between the richest people in this country and the poorest people in this country, and that gap being wider than is healthy. And that does make it difficult for a country to maintain democracy if people feel, if a lot of the voters feel there's no point voting because the system is stacked against me. I'm not quite so sure what you can do about improving democracy. One thing, reducing inequality. Clearly, if you can have a tax collection system that's effective, that will increase equality in the society, because the more people have, the more tax they will pay. The more money people have, the more tax they will pay. If, on the other hand, your tax collection system is not efficient, you're probably likely to have more inequality. So having a good system of taxation that works and that everybody pays and that's transparent, and where perhaps even as in Denmark, the exact amount of tax that everybody pays is published in a telephone book, and you can look it up. If you are a Dane and you want to know whether your neighbour has paid his tax, you can check it out and see how much exactly your neighbour has paid in tax. That's perhaps an extreme method, but it's a method whereby Denmark, which as Jack Straw referred to, is one of those countries that has the highest level of equality, how they are able actually to collect their taxes in an effective way. Perhaps they should introduce that in Greece, or perhaps they will introduce that in Greece, because clearly tax collection, or the lack of tax collection, was one of the problems that led to the difficulties that Greece faced.